I want you to start off by putting yourself in a very specific and honestly very terrifying scenario.
Okay.
Imagine you are a highly trained winter survivalist. You're zipped up inside this heavy canvas tent, pitched on the slope of a really remote mountain.
Right. Sounds intense.
Yeah, and outside, it is pitch black, and there's a lethal blizzard howling. The temperature has just plummeted to a bone-chilling minus 30 degrees Celsius.
Oh, wow. That is incredibly cold.
Exactly. That tent is literally the only thing keeping you alive.
Oh.
So I want you to ask yourself, what could possibly be out there in the dark? Like, what could you possibly hear or see that would compel you to grab a knife, slice your way out of your own shelter, and run into the freezing snow wearing only your socks?
I mean, it's a scenario that completely defies every logical survival mechanism wired into the human brain.
Right.
You are essentially choosing a freezing, agonizing death over whatever is inside or just outside that canvas.
And that impossible choice is really the focal point of today's deep dive. As anyone who follows historical anomalies knows, we are looking at the sources detailing the terror on the Dead Mountain.
The Dyatlov Pass incident of February 1959.
That's the one. It is widely considered one of modern history's most baffling unsolved mysteries. But our mission today isn't just to, recount a ghost story you might have heard around a campfire.
No, absolutely not.
We're going to dig into the actual forensic pathology, we're going to reconstruct the timeline, and rigorously test the physical evidence against all the competing theories.
Yeah, we want to understand the exact mechanisms of what happens when the meticulous, ironclad logic of survival experts just entirely breaks down.
Exactly.
But to do that, we really have to establish the baseline of competence we are dealing with here.
Right. Who are these people?
Well, in late January 1959, 10 hikers set out on a skiing expedition deep into the northern Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia, and they were led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov.
Hence the name of the pass.
Exactly. Now, their goal was to reach a remote peak called Mount Otorten, and completing this specific trek at this time of year, well, it would earn them a grade 3rd certification.
Which was the highest level Soviet trekking certification available at the time, right?
Yes, exactly.
And I think that certification detail is just crucial because when people hear about a group of 20-somethings disappearing in the woods, it is very easy to default to that horror movie trope.
Oh, definitely. The naive teenagers wandering off the trail without a map.
Right, exactly. But these were students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They had extensive documented experience surviving brutal Soviet winters.
They really did.
To use an analogy, these were the Olympic-level athletes of the wilderness. They knew the terrain, they knew the weather, and they absolutely knew their gear.
Yeah, their extreme competence is exactly what makes the forensic evidence of their demise so incredibly frustrating to analyze.
Right, because if an amateur freezes to death in the wilderness, I mean, it's a tragedy, but it's an explainable one.
Exactly. You look for a lost compass, inadequate clothing, or maybe a sudden drop in barometric pressure.
Yeah.
But when experts die in a way that directly contradicts their rigorous training, it signals a massive behavioral anomaly. Something introduced a variable they just could not calculate for.
Wow, yeah.
And just as a quick aside, one hiker, Yuri Yudin, he actually developed severe joint pain early in the trek and had to turn back.
Oh, wow. Talk about a twist of fate.
Right. That single biological twist of fate made him the sole survivor of the expedition because the remaining 9 continued into the mountains and none of them were ever seen alive again.
That is just chilling. And because they were such seasoned experts, there was no immediate panic when they failed to send their scheduled telegram upon reaching their destination.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, if you're listening to this and you've done any backcountry hiking, you know delays are just par for the course. Equipment breaks, snow drifts, slow your pace, you get weathered in.
You don't immediately assume the worst.
Right. The families and authorities just assumed a routine delay. But by February 20th, when search parties were finally launched into the Urals, that assumption was just completely violently shattered.
It really was. The search party eventually tracked the group's route to the eastern shoulder of a mountain called Kholat Sakal.
And doesn't that translate to something pretty ominous?
Yeah, in the local Mansi language, it translates to Mountain of the Dead.
Well, that's not unsettling at all.
No, not at all. And right there on the exposed slope, they found the hiker's tent. It was partially buried under snowdrift, but structurally the poles were largely intact.
Okay.
However, the investigators immediately realized they were looking at a crime scene, or at the very least, a scene of profound panic.
Because the tent hadn't been unzipped, right?
Right.
The heavy canvas had been slashed open.
Yeah.
And the forensic fabric analysis, like looking at the direction of the frayed threads, it proved definitively that those long, frantic slashes were made from the inside.
Which is just wild to think about.
Right. Because if I am cutting my way out of my own tent, it means the primary exit is physically blocked.
Yeah.
Or my fear is so acute that I do not have the, 3 to 5 seconds required to unlace the front flap.
Yeah, it is an act of unadulterated panic. But the inventory inside the tent deepens the paradox even further.
What did they find?
Investigators found almost all of the group's heavy winter coats, their insulated boots, their rations, and their survival gear just left behind.
They abandoned the only things that could keep them alive in a minus 30-degree environment.
Exactly.
Which logically implies they were fleeing a threat that demanded immediate chaotic evacuation. But, and this is where it gets so weird, the physical evidence completely contradicts that assumption.
Yeah, the footprints.
Right. Leading away from the slashed tent, down the slope toward a dark tree line, the search party found 9 sets of footprints. Now, if you are fleeing for your life, your stride lengthens, your weight distribution shifts to the balls of your feet, and you leave scattered, frantic tracks.
But that's not what they found.
No. These footprints showed a steady, calm, deliberate walking pace for nearly a mile downhill.
The preservation of those footprints is actually a meteorological anomaly in itself. The specific weather conditions, the weight of their steps compressing the snow, followed by the wind blowing away the loose top powder, it left their tracks standing out like elevated columns.
Wow.
And those columns showed people walking in only socks, some completely barefoot, and some wearing just a single shoe.
Which is insane. You have this sudden, violent panic of slicing the tent, instantly followed by an orderly, deliberate descent into lethal temperatures.
Right. It's as though the initial threat was so highly localized to the physical space of the tent that it forced them out, but once they were out on the slope, they felt safe enough to walk.
Or perhaps they were just trying to carefully navigate in the pitch black so they wouldn't break an ankle.
That's very possible.
But following those calm footprints down into the dark tree line leads to the first grim discoveries. Because at the edge of the forest, beneath a large, ancient cedar tree, the search party found the remains of a small, improvised fire.
Right.
And beside it were the first 2 bodies.
Yeah, and the physical state of those 2 hikers tells a tragic story of shifting psychology. They were found wearing only their underwear, their hands were badly burned, raw and bleeding.
Oh, God.
And branches on the cedar tree were broken up to 5 meters high, indicating they had frantically climbed the tree.
Right, and for anyone listening who studies extreme environment survival, the state of their clothing immediately signals a well-documented physiological phenomenon.
Paradoxical undressing.
Exactly. As hypothermia sets in and your core temperature drops, the muscles controlling your peripheral blood vessels become exhausted and relax. Suddenly, a rush of warm blood from your core floods your extremities.
And your brain just misinterprets it.
Yeah, your freezing, confused brain misinterprets this rapid vasodilation and tells you, I am burning up, causing you to frantically strip off your clothes in a sub-zero blizzard.
It's horrifying. But the medical examiner's reports align perfectly with that sequence of hypothermic delirium. However, the torn hands and the broken branches up the cedar tree suggest a desperate, highly lucid struggle before the hypothermia took full effect.
Right, because climbing a rough pine tree barehanded tears your skin to shreds.
Exactly. You only endure that kind of agonizing pain if staying on the ground means certain death.
Yeah. My theory on the tree climbing is that they were desperately trying to gain elevation to get a visual on their tent up the slope.
To see if it was safe to go back.
Right. They were freezing, they realized the fire wasn't enough, and they were hoping whatever drove them out of the tent had passed so they could return for their coats, or the much more terrifying hypothesis, they were climbing to escape something actively hunting them in the darkness below.
Right. Whatever their motivation was, the scene reveals a fracture in the group's strategy. Because between that cedar tree and the slashed tent up the slope, rescuers found 3 more bodies, including the expedition leader, Igor Dyatlov.
And they were facing the tent, right?
Yeah, scattered at different intervals, all frozen in poses facing the tent. At least 3 of them realized the forest edge was a death trap and made the agonizing decision to try and crawl back up the mountain to their supplies.
Now, dying of hypothermia in minus 30 degrees, it makes tragic, terrible medical sense.
It does.
If the story ended here, it would be a bizarre, haunting tragedy, but a scientifically understandable one. But our deep dive pivots drastically here.
Because of the remaining 4 hikers.
Right. They weren't found for another 2 months. And when the spring thaw finally allowed searchers to pull them from a deep forest ravine, their autopsies completely defied all medical logic.
Yeah, down in that ravine, buried under meters of packed snow, the state of the final 4 bodies escalated this case from a survival mystery into a biomechanical anomaly.
What do they find?
We are no longer talking about extreme frostbite here. The autopsies revealed massive internal trauma. One hiker suffered severe skull fractures. 2 others had their ribs crushed so violently that their chest cavities had collapsed inward.
That is just, the medical examiners at the time quantified that trauma explicitly. They likened the sheer, localized force required to shatter a human rib cage in that manner to the impact of a high-speed car crash.
A car crash?
Think about the blunt force trauma of a body hitting a brick wall at 60 miles an hour. That is the kinetic energy we are talking about. If you are listening to this and wondering how someone sustains a car crash-level injury in a snowbank in a remote forest, well, you are exactly where the Soviet investigators were.
And here's the variable that makes those injuries physically impossible under normal parameters.
Okay.
There was virtually no external soft tissue damage associated with the blunt force trauma.
Wait, really? None?
Almost none.
Because if you get hit by a car or trampled by a moose or crushed by a boulder, your skin is going to show massive lacerations, contusions, and defensive scrapes.
Exactly. But these hikers had zero evidence of a physical struggle. It was as if enormous, localized pressure had compressed their bodies from the inside out, completely bypassing the skin.
That is insane.
It implies a massive compressive force rather than a shearing force. And while we're discussing the unsettling autopsy details, we have to address the state of the soft tissue.
Oh, right.
One of the hikers, Ludmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue, her eyes, and part of her facial tissue. Another hiker was also missing their eyes.
And look, people often jump straight to the supernatural or ritualistic here. But if we look at the taphonomy, the scientific study of decaying organisms, there is a logical mechanism.
Right, the water.
Yeah, the bodies were submerged in a ravine with running meltwater for 2 months. Small scavengers, birds, and the abrasive action of water naturally target the softest exposed tissues first. The missing eyes and tongue are horrifying, absolutely, but they are forensically explainable.
Yes, the taphonomy accounts for the soft tissue, but it absolutely fails to account for the shattered ribs and the skull fracture. To explain injuries that seem physically impossible without an external vehicle, investigators, and eventually the public, began looking at highly unusual environmental clues found around the mountain.
And this is where the sheer volume of anomalous data points just starts to overwhelm the investigation. First, you have the radiation.
Right, the radiation.
Tests run on several articles of the hiker's clothing revealed unusually high levels of beta radiation. It wasn't enough to cause acute radiation sickness, but why are hikers in the middle of a pristine wilderness covered in radioactive isotopes?
It's a huge red flag. Then you add the meteorological and witness reports. People living in nearby regions, including military personnel and weather station operators, reported seeing glowing orange spheres floating and maneuvering in the night sky around the exact time the hikers perished.
Glowing orbs.
Yeah.
And to cap it all off, the Soviet authorities swooped in, rapidly sealed the investigation records, classified the autopsies, and officially concluded the case with a deeply unsettling, heavily bureaucratic statement.
What did it say?
They ruled that the hikers died because of a, quote, compelling natural force. Case closed. No further explanation.
Which naturally created a vacuum that 60 years of scientific and historical theories have just rushed to fill.
Right.
And we need to evaluate the mechanics of these competing theories impartially, because every model struggles with at least one piece of evidence. Let's start with the official 2019 Russian government conclusion, the avalanche theory.
Okay, so the mechanics of the avalanche theory argue that a localized slab of snow broke loose on the mountain above the tent. The hikers heard it cracking, panicked, slashed the tent to avoid being buried alive, and fled.
Makes sense on the surface.
But if we look at the topography, the slope angle of Kholat Shach, where they pitched the tent, was only about 15 to 20 degrees. The physics of snowpack dictate you typically need at least a 30-degree incline to trigger a slab avalanche.
Well, avalanche proponents argue that the specific cut the hikers made into the snowbank to pitch the tent compromised the structural integrity of the snowpack above them, causing a micro-avalanche.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, this heavy block of dense snow sliding over the tent could theoretically explain the crushed ribs of the hikers who might have been sleeping on their back.
Okay, but that completely ignores the footprints. If a massive wall of shifting snow sweeps over a campsite, How do 9 distinct sets of footprints survive clearly on the surface of the snow for 3 weeks? Avalanches destroy footprints, they don't preserve them. And why was the tent found mostly intact with the poles upright?
It's a fair point. The physics of the snow slab don't elegantly map onto the footprint evidence. This brings us to a more obscure but biologically fascinating scientific theory, infrasound.
Oh, this one relies on a phenomenon called a Kármán vortex street, right?
Sure.
Explain how wind physics can essentially hijack the human nervous system.
So, under very specific topographical conditions, hurricane-force winds rushing over the dome-like peak of the mountain can create a vortex, a repeating pattern of swirling vortices that generate a low-frequency sound wave called infrasound.
Yeah.
It sits below the threshold of human hearing, usually around 7 to 9 hertz. You can't hear it, but your body acts as a resonant cavity and literally feels the vibration.
And neurological studies show that infrasound directly stimulates the amygdala. It causes massive spikes in cortisol, triggering overwhelming irrational fear, panic attacks, and a profound sense of impending doom.
Wow.
Yeah, the mountain itself becomes a giant, invisible subwoofer, vibrating at a frequency that tricks your brain into thinking you're about to die.
See, it is an elegant mechanism that perfectly explains the sudden, violent panic of slashing the tent and fleeing half naked. A survival expert's logic is useless against a biological hijacking of their nervous system.
All right.
However, the infrasound theory completely fails to explain the crushed ribs, the fractured skulls in the ravine, and the radioactive clothing.
Exactly the problem. It answers the psychology, but totally ignores the pathology, which leads many researchers to look at the geopolitical context of 1959. Theory 3 revolves around secret Soviet military testing.
Yeah, the northern Urals were definitely remote enough for highly classified weapons experiments.
And this model attempts to synthesize the weirdest data points. If the military was testing high-altitude parachute mines or early intercontinental ballistic missiles, it could explain the glowing orange orbs witnessed in the sky.
Right. And if an aerial explosion occurred, a concussive airburst shockwave could theoretically cause massive internal compression injuries, shattering ribs, without leaving external lacerations.
A concussive blast wave maps perfectly onto the car crash pathology, and it easily explains the beta radiation on their clothes, as well as the government's rapid deployment to seal the files and blame a vague natural force.
But the timeline is the Achilles heel of the military theory.
How so?
If a massive explosive shockwave hit the tent, why were the footprints walking away so calm and orderly? Why did they take the time to meticulously build a fire down at the tree line?
Oh, that's true. The chronology breaks down.
Yeah, you cannot have a chaotic, bone-crushing explosion and an orderly, barefoot march down a mountain simultaneously.
No, you can't. And because the scientific and military models have these glaring physical contradictions, we have to look at the fourth category, the unknown.
Right.
For anyone familiar with the deeper lore of Kholat Shakal, you know it is steeped in indigenous Mansi legend. And we aren't just talking about ghost stories here. We're talking about deeply ingrained cultural warnings about territorial boundaries.
Yeah.
The local oral histories speak of protective mountain spirits, sometimes referred to as the Mank, which are often equated to an aggressive, hyper-territorial cryptid, kind of similar to a Yeti.
And when anthropologists study these localized legends, they often find they are rooted in historical survival mechanisms, basically a way to keep people away from highly dangerous, avalanche-prone, or predator-heavy areas.
Exactly.
But when you are looking at autopsy reports detailing a chest cavity crushed with the localized force of a high-speed impact, and you want to avoid the complex physics of airburst munitions, well, a massive, powerful biological entity suddenly becomes a highly tempting alternative for researchers.
Because it bridges the gap. A massive external threat explains the slashed tent, the desperate flight to the trees, climbing the cedar to escape the ground, and the localized blunt force trauma.
But again, it fails the footprint test.
Right.
There were no anomalous tracks found in the snow alongside the hikers' prints. No massive footprints. No sign of a physical struggle at all.
And that brings us to the core, really maddening frustration of the Dyatlov Pass incident. There is no single theory that unifies the data.
None.
The snow slab explains the departure but fails the footprints. The infrasound explains the panic but fails the trauma. The military tests explain the radiation and the internal crushing but fail the chronological timeline.
Yeah, every time you construct a hypothesis, a piece of hard forensic evidence completely dismantles it.
More than 60 years later, the mountain kept its secrets. 10 young, vibrant, expert hikers went into the Urals, and the environment absorbed them in a way we still cannot decode. I want you to reflect on your own psychological breaking point for a second.
It's hard to even imagine.
Think about your deepest, most hardwired survival instincts. Imagine your own body temperature dropping. What would it take for your own brain to override everything you know, to decide that the freezing lethal darkness of a -30-degree blizzard is the safer option? Like, what mathematical equation has to happen in your head to make you cut the canvas?
I've read through these case files a dozen times, analyzing the variables, and that is the one human element that always stops me dead in my tracks. What makes a trained expert willingly choose the cold?
It's the variable we just can't quantify. And I want to leave you with one final, deeply unsettling detail from the sources that we haven't touched on yet.
Oh, the camera.
Yeah. During the investigation, searchers recovered a camera from the expedition's gear. It contained the final photographs taken by the hikers shortly before the incident.
And they are so eerie.
The authorities developed the film, and the final frames on the roll are dark, blurry, and chaotic. They show distorted, glowing shapes and dark figures standing in the deep snow beneath black skies.
And while photo analysts have tried to dismiss them as double exposures or artifacts of a damaged camera shutter, anyone who studies the visual evidence of this case describes those final frames as deeply haunting.
They really are.
They lack any clear definition, but they capture the visual chaos of their final moments.
It leaves you with a lingering, visceral question to explore on your own. Did the hikers capture the very thing that doomed them on film? What exactly did they see standing out there in the darkness before the panic set in? Imagine again, you are in that tent, you hear the wind, and then you hear something else. You grab the knife, you slice the canvas, and you step out into the cold.
You really have to wonder what was waiting for them in the snow.
Until next time, keep digging.